Imagine this. It's June 1940. The world is holding its breath. One by one, the nations of Europe have fallen to the relentless march of Hitler's armies. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and now, the unthinkable has happened. France has surrendered. The British Expeditionary Force, cornered and seemingly doomed, has been miraculously evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. But it's a retreat, not a victory. They left behind nearly all their heavy equipment tanks, artillery, vehicles. Britain is now vulnerable, exposed. Across the narrow English Channel, the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen is gathering, preparing for the final blow. In this terrifying moment, Britain stands utterly alone. The United States is neutral, bound by its policy of isolationism. The Soviet Union has a non-aggression pact with Germany. There are no major allies left on the continent. The entire weight of the free world rests on the shoulders of this one island nation. It's in this darkest of hours that a voice rings out. A voice of defiance that will echo through history. Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, addresses his people, not with false promises of easy victory, but with a stark and brutal honesty. He offers nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He vows to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets, and in the hills. He declares that Britain will never surrender. This wasn't just rhetoric, it was a national promise. Churchill's words galvanized the British people. They knew the odds were impossible. They knew an invasion was imminent. But instead of despair, there was a surge of defiant spirit. The Home Guard, a citizen militia often armed with little more than antique rifles and farm tools, drilled in villages and towns, ready to make the invaders pay for every inch of British soil. Then came the fury from the skies. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, launched a massive aerial assault. Their goal was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, gain control of the skies, and clear the way for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. This was the Battle of Britain. Day after day, the skies over southern England became a stage for a desperate, swirling dogfight. A handful of young RAF pilots, flying their iconic Spitfires and Hurricanes, rose to meet wave after wave of German bombers and fighters. They were outnumbered, exhausted, flying multiple sorties a day. Many were just boys, barely out of their teens. Yet, they held the line. As Churchill would later say, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Against all expectations, the few succeeded. The Luftwaffe could not break the RF. By September, Hitler was forced to postpone the invasion indefinitely. Britain had survived its most perilous moment, but the ordeal was far from over. Frustrated by his failure to achieve air superiority, Hitler changed tactics. If he couldn't break Britain's military, he would break its spirit. This was the beginning of the Blitz, starting in September 1940 and lasting for 8 brutal months. German bombers targeted Britain's cities, night after night. London, Coventry, Liverpool, Manchester. The bombs rained down indiscriminately. The nights were filled with the wail of air raid sirens, the thunder of explosions, and the glow of massive fires that turned the sky red. People huddled in Anderson shelters in their backyards or in the depths of London's underground stations. Every morning brought a new landscape of destruction. Homes reduced to rubble, historic landmarks gutted by fire, streets cratered and blocked. The Blitz was a campaign of terror, designed to sow panic and force a surrender. But it had the opposite effect. The shared danger and suffering forged an unbreakable bond among the British people. Strangers helped each other from bombed-out houses. Volunteer firemen battled impossible blazes. Rescue workers dug tirelessly for survivors. The famous Blitz spirit was born a mixture of stoicism, dark humor, and a stubborn refusal to be beaten. People would emerge from the shelters in the morning, survey the damage, and then simply get on with their day, determined to carry on as normally as possible. While the home front endured, the war at sea raged on. Britain, an island nation, depended on imports for its survival: food, fuel, raw materials, and weapons. German U-boats, operating in deadly wolf packs, prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships with terrifying efficiency. The Battle of the Atlantic was a slow, grinding war of attrition. For every ship that made it to a British port, another might be sent to the bottom of the ocean. The sailors of the Merchant Navy and the Royal Navy faced constant danger from submarines, mines, and aircraft, fighting a lonely war in the vast, cold emptiness of the sea. By 1941, the strain was immense. Britain was financially exhausted. The nation had poured all its resources into the war effort. It was fighting in the Atlantic, in the skies over Britain, and now in North Africa and the Mediterranean against German and Italian forces. The country was stretched to its absolute limit, fighting a global war with the resources of a single nation. There were glimmers of hope. The Lend-Lease Act, passed by the United States in March 1941, allowed Britain to obtain vital war materials on credit. It was a lifeline, what Churchill called the new Magna Carta. But the U.S. was still not in the war. Britain was still fighting alone. The future remained uncertain. Every day was a struggle for survival, a testament to endurance against overwhelming odds. For 18 long months, from the fall of France to the final days of 1941, this small island stood as the last bastion of democracy in Europe. It was a nation standing alone, battered but unbowed, fueled by the defiant leadership of Churchill and the incredible resilience of its people. They didn't know if or when help would come. They only knew they had to hold on, and in holding on, they saved not only themselves, but the hope of freedom for the entire world. The story of what happened next, how the tide of the war finally began to turn, is for another time. Today, we're exploring a story of friendship, desperation, and brilliant diplomacy that unfolded across the Atlantic Ocean. It asks the story of how one man's words helped save a nation and shape the course of the war. This is the tale of Winston Churchill's letters across the sea to Franklin D. Roosevelt. The year is 1940. The situation in Europe is catastrophic. Nazi Germany has blitzed its way across the continent. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and now France have all fallen under the might of the German war machine. Britain stands alone, an island bastion against a seemingly unstoppable tide of tyranny. The British Army, though miraculously evacuated from Dunkirk, has left most of its heavy equipment behind. The Royal Air Force is stretched to its absolute limit, fighting the Battle of Britain in the skies over southern England. The threat of a German invasion is not a distant fear. It is an immediate, terrifying reality. In this darkest of hours, a new Prime Minister takes the helm, Winston Churchill. He's a man known for his bulldog spirit and his powerful oratory, but even he knows that spirit alone cannot win a war against such overwhelming odds. Britain needs help. It needs weapons. It needs ships. It needs supplies. And most of all, it needs a powerful ally. And there is only one nation on earth that can provide what is needed: the United States of America. But there's a major problem. America is officially neutral. A powerful isolationist movement, scarred by the memory of World War I, wants nothing to do with another European conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt is sympathetic to Britain's plight, but his hands are tied by public opinion and by Congress. He cannot simply declare war or send aid without navigating a political minefield. This is where our story truly begins. Unable to meet in person, Churchill and Roosevelt started what would become one of the most consequential correspondences in history. Over the next few years, they would exchange nearly 2,000 messages. Churchill, a master of the English language, knew that these letters were his most vital weapon. He had to persuade Roosevelt, and through him, the American people, that Britain's fight was their fight too. He signed his first message as Prime Minister simply, "Former naval person." This was a clever, personal touch. Both men had served as the heads of their respective navies, creating an instant bond, a shared identity that transcended their official titles. It set the tone for a correspondence that was both deeply personal and intensely professional. In his early letters, Churchill's tone was urgent, almost desperate. He laid out the grim reality of Britain's situation with stark clarity. He wasn't just asking for help. He was painting a vivid picture of a world on the brink of disaster. On May 15, 1940, just days after becoming Prime Minister, He wrote to Roosevelt, "The scene has darkened swiftly. The small countries are simply smashed up, one by one, like." He detailed his need for 40 or 50 of your older destroyers to protect the vital Atlantic convoy routes from German U-boats, which were strangling Britain's supply lines. Churchill's prose was magnificent. It was eloquent, powerful, and deeply moving. He wasn't just a politician writing a memo. He was a historian, a writer, and a leader, pouring his nation's soul onto the page. He wrote of the common cause, the shared heritage of the English-speaking peoples, and the universal ideals of freedom and democracy that were under threat. He knew Roosevelt was a man who understood history and grand strategy. So he framed his requests not as a plea for charity, but as a strategic necessity for the defense of civilization itself. Roosevelt was receptive but cautious. He had to move slowly. The first major breakthrough came with the Destroyers for Bases Agreement in September 1940. It was a masterful piece of political maneuvering. The U.S. would provide Britain with 50 aging destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on naval and air bases in British territories across the Atlantic. This deal allowed Roosevelt to help Britain. While framing it as a move to bolster America's own defenses, it was a decidedly unneutral act. As Churchill later called it, a crucial first step in America's shift away from strict neutrality. But as 1940 turned into 1941, Britain's financial situation became dire. The country was running out of money to pay for the weapons and supplies it desperately needed. Churchill sent what he considered the most important letter he ever wrote. It was a massive document, over 4,000 words long, that he spent weeks perfecting. He laid out the entire strategic situation, from the Atlantic to the Middle East, and explained that soon, Britain would no longer be able to pay for American goods. He wrote, "The moment is approaching when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies." This was the moment of truth. If American aid stopped, Britain would fall. Roosevelt's response to this letter was pure political genius. He knew he couldn't just give or loan money to Britain. The isolationists in Congress would never approve it. Instead, he came up with a simple, brilliant analogy. He told the press, "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose, ... I don't say to him, 'Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it.' I don't want $15, I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." This was the birth of the Lend-Lease Act. America would not sell weapons. It would lend or lease them to any country whose defense was deemed vital to the defense of the United States. It was, as Roosevelt called it, the arsenal of democracy. Churchill described it as the most unsorted act in the whole of recorded history. The act was passed in March 1941, and it opened the floodgates. An immense flow of American-made tanks, planes, ships, and food began to cross the Atlantic, keeping Britain in the fight. Throughout this period, the letters continued. They were filled with strategic updates, intelligence sharing, and frank discussions of the war's progress, but they were also filled with personal touches. Churchill would share poems and bits of news, and they developed a genuine warmth and friendship. They discussed the possibility of a meeting, a personal conference that would finally bring the two leaders face to face. Churchill's goal, however, remained unchanged. He knew that while Lend-Lease was keeping Britain alive, it would take America's full military involvement to actually win the war. His letters subtly, persistently, nudged Roosevelt in that direction. He shared intelligence about German intentions and warned of the long-term dangers if the Axis powers were allowed to consolidate their gains. He was preparing the ground, arguing that America's and Britain's destinies were intertwined. The letters show a masterclass in persuasion. Churchill balanced dire warnings with expressions of unwavering resolve. He never begged, but he made the consequences of inaction terrifyingly clear. He appealed to Roosevelt's sense of duty, his strategic mind, and their shared values. He was a partner, a strategist, and a friend, all through the medium of the written word. This extraordinary correspondence laid the foundation for the Grand Alliance. It built a bridge of trust and cooperation across the Atlantic when no physical bridge could be built. Churchill's persistent, eloquent, and powerful words were as crucial as any ship or squadron of They kept hope alive, secured the means for survival, and slowly, inexorably, drew the world's greatest industrial power into the fight for freedom. The final push would come not from a letter, but from the shocking attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. But the groundwork for the immediate and powerful Anglo-American alliance that followed was laid in those hundreds of secret messages, typed and telegraphed across a war-torn ocean. It was a dialogue that saved a nation and, ultimately, helped save the world. The story of this unique relationship is a testament to the power of words and leadership in the most challenging of times. Imagine this. It's early 1941. Darkness is falling across Europe. Britain stands alone, a defiant island against a tide of tyranny. Its fate, and perhaps the fate of the free world, hangs precariously in the balance. In this desperate hour, Britain's survival depends on one thing above all else: help from the United States. But America is officially neutral, bound by public opinion and political caution. What could possibly bridge this vast ocean of policy and distance? The answer wasn't a treaty, a pact, or a formal declaration. It was a friendship forged by necessity between two of the 20th century's most formidable leaders, Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is the story of how their personal chemistry became the world's most powerful weapon. Before they became the iconic duo of World War II, Churchill and Roosevelt were, in many ways, polar opposites. Churchill was the bulldog, the aristocrat, with a flair for the dramatic, fueled by brandy and cigars. He was impulsive, emotional, and wore his heart on his sleeve. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was the cool, calculating political master, an American patrician, wheelchair, bound but radiating an unshakable confidence. He was guarded, enigmatic, a man who played his cards very close to his chest. On paper, they shouldn't have clicked, but history, and indeed humanity, often defies expectations. Their relationship began not in a grand summit, but through a series of letters and cables, a correspondence that crackled with urgency and intellect. Churchill, ever the wordsmith, signed his messages from a naval person, a nod to their shared past as heads of their respective navies. It was a clever, personal touch that immediately broke through the stiff formalities of international diplomacy. Roosevelt, for his part, was deeply impressed by Churchill's spirit. Here was a man who, in the face of unimaginable pressure, refused to yield. Churchill's famous speeches, broadcast across the Atlantic, were more than just rhetoric to Roosevelt. They were a lifeline of hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He saw in Churchill a partner who shared his fundamental belief in democracy and freedom, but admiration alone couldn't change American policy. The U.S. was deeply isolationist. Roosevelt had to navigate a treacherous political landscape. He knew that any overt move to help Britain could be political suicide. He needed to prepare the American people to shift public opinion from neutrality to support. He needed a way to help Britain without formally going to war. This is where the personal connection became paramount. Churchill's desperate pleas for ships, planes, and munitions were not just official requests from one government to another. They were personal appeals from one man to another, a man he was beginning to see as a friend. The real turning point in their relationship, and in the war, came with the Lend-Lease Act. This was Roosevelt's master. The idea was brilliantly simple, and he explained it to the American people with a classic, down-to-earth analogy. He said, "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire." The logic was undeniable. You don't sell the hose. You lend it, and you get it back after the fire is out. This analogy transformed a complex piece of foreign policy into a simple act of neighborly duty. Lend-Lease allowed the U.S. to supply Britain and other allied nations with war materials, effectively becoming the arsenal of democracy without technically entering the war. It was a lifeline for Britain, the very garden hose Churchill needed to fight the fire raging across Europe. But getting this radical idea through Congress was a monumental battle, and it was Roosevelt's trust in Churchill's leadership and his commitment to Britain's cause that fueled his determination to see it through. He was betting on a man he had still only ever communicated with from a distance. The true test of their chemistry came when they finally met in person. Churchill's key envoy, Harry Hopkins, a close confidant of Roosevelt, was sent to London in January 1941 to assess the situation firsthand. Hopkins was Roosevelt's eyes and ears. His impression of Churchill would be crucial. The two men hit it off immediately. Hopkins was captivated by Churchill's energy, his intellect, and his unyielding resolve. After spending weeks with him, Hopkins sent an infamous cable back to Roosevelt, quoting a line from the Bible: "Whither thou goest, I will go, even to the end." The message was clear. Churchill was a man worth backing, completely and without reservation. This report from a trusted friend solidified Roosevelt's conviction. The bond was no longer just political, it was personal. Hopkins' visit paved the way for the leaders' own historic meetings. This friendship wasn't just about grand strategy. It was built on small, human moments. They shared a love for naval history, a wicked sense of humor, and a habit of working late into the night. Roosevelt was charmed by Churchill's eccentricities, like his habit of dictating from his bathtub. Churchill, in turn, was in awe of Roosevelt's political skill and his ability to inspire a nation. They could argue fiercely over military strategy or colonial policy, but their arguments were those of partners, not adversaries. There was a foundation of mutual respect and affection that transcended their political differences. This personal connection allowed them to be candid, to push each other, and to find common ground where diplomats and bureaucrats might have failed. When they disagreed, they knew the underlying friendship was strong enough to withstand the strain. This trust was the secret ingredient that made their alliance work. It transformed a relationship born of necessity into a genuine partnership. So, as 1941 unfolded, the fate of the world was being shaped not only in cabinet rooms and on battlefields, but in the private correspondence and late-night conversations between two extraordinary men. The political alliance that Britain desperately needed for its survival was cemented by a personal chemistry that was as powerful as any army. It was a friendship that provided the crucial spark, the human element that allowed the United States to step up and become the arsenal of democracy. It's a powerful reminder that in times of crisis, leadership is not just about policy and power. It's about connection, trust, and the profound impact of one human being on another. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on the road to World War II. Today, we're diving into a crucial period, March to December 1941. This is the year America, while officially neutral, began to decisively edge toward intervention. The question was no longer if America would get involved, but how and when. By early 1941, the situation in Europe was grim. Britain stood virtually alone against the relentless Nazi war machine. Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a desperate plea to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He famously said, "The moment is approaching when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies." Britain was running out of money, and without American help, the war effort could collapse. Roosevelt, a shrewd political operator, understood the danger. He knew that a Nazi-dominated Europe would be a direct threat to the United States. However, he also faced a deeply isolationist public and a Congress wary of foreign entanglement. The memory of World War I was still fresh, and many Americans wanted no part in another European conflict. The powerful America First Committee, with prominent speakers like Charles Lindbergh, argued passionately for non-intervention, claiming it was Europe's war, not America's. So, how could Roosevelt help Britain without formally declaring war? His answer was a stroke of political genius: the Lend-Lease Act. In a fireside chat, he explained the concept using a simple analogy. He said, "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. You don't sell the hose in that moment. You lend it to him. Once the fire is out, he returns it or replaces it." This brilliant, folksy explanation made the idea accessible and palatable to the American people. The Lend-Lease Act, signed into law in March 1941, was a game-changer. It gave the president the authority to sell, transfer, exchange, or lend equipment and supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. The initial appropriation was a staggering $7 billion. This wasn't just a loan of a garden hose. It was a massive commitment. America was becoming, as Roosevelt called it, the arsenal of democracy. Trucks, planes, tanks, and weapons began to flow across the Atlantic, providing a critical lifeline to Britain and, later, to other Allied nations. But getting the supplies to Britain was another problem entirely. The North Atlantic was a hunting ground for German U-boats, the infamous wolf packs. These submarines were sinking Allied ships at an alarming rate, threatening to sever the supply line that Lend-Lease had created. Churchill pleaded for American naval assistance to protect the convoys. Once again, Roosevelt had to walk a fine line. Direct military escorts would be an act of war. So, he took a series of incremental steps. First, in April 1941, the U.S. extended its Pan-American security zone far out into the Atlantic. This allowed the U.S. Navy to patrol these waters and report U-boat sightings to the British. It was a clever workaround. America wasn't attacking the U-boats, just observing and reporting. Think of it as a neighborhood watch for the high seas. Then, in July, came an even bolder move. The United States occupied Iceland. This was strategically vital. It provided a forward base for American naval and air patrols, extending their reach even further across the Atlantic. From Iceland, U.S. warships could effectively escort convoys halfway to Britain, where the Royal Navy would then take over. This hemispheric defense was pushing the definition of neutrality to its absolute limit. Throughout the spring and summer, public opinion in America was slowly but surely shifting. The relentless Nazi advances and the brutal bombing of British cities, brought to American homes through radio broadcasts by journalists like Edward R. Murrow, began to erode the isolationist sentiment. People were starting to see the war not as a distant European squabble, but as a global struggle between freedom and tyranny. Then, in June 1941, the entire strategic landscape of the war changed overnight. Hitler, in a massive strategic blunder, invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was a shocking development. Suddenly, the two totalitarian giants, Nazi Germany and the communist USSR, were locked in a death struggle. For Roosevelt and Churchill, this was a massive opportunity. An enemy of their enemy was now, begrudgingly, a friend. Roosevelt, despite deep American anti-communist feelings, extended Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. It was a pragmatic decision. Every German soldier fighting on the Eastern Front was one less soldier Britain and, potentially, America would have to face. In August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met in secret aboard warships off the coast of Newfoundland. This clandestine meeting resulted in the Atlantic Charter. It was a remarkable document, not a formal treaty, but a joint declaration of war aims. It called for self-determination for all peoples, freer trade, and a system of general security laying the groundwork for the future United Nations. The Atlantic Charter was a powerful statement of shared values and a clear signal to the world that the United States was aligning itself with the Allied cause, even without a formal declaration of war. As 1941 wore on, the undeclared war in the Atlantic escalated. In September, a German U-boat fired on the American destroyer, the USS Greer. Roosevelt seized the opportunity. In a fiery speech, he declared that German submarines were the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic and issued a shoot-on-sight order against any German or Italian vessel in America's defensive waters. This was a major escalation. The U.S. Navy was now actively engaged in combat operations against the Axis in the Atlantic. The inevitable followed. In October, the destroyer USS Kearney was torpedoed, killing 11 American sailors. 2 weeks later, the USS Reuben James was sunk while escorting a convoy, with the loss of over 100 American lives. These were the first American military casualties of the war. In response, Congress revised the Neutrality Acts yet again, this time allowing American merchant ships to be armed and to sail directly into combat zones and British ports. For all intents and purposes, the United States was now fighting a naval war in the Atlantic. By December 1941, America was teetering on the brink. The nation was providing massive aid to the Allies. Its navy was fighting German U-boats in the Atlantic, and public opinion had swung firmly in favor of supporting Britain. The isolationist argument was losing ground with every sunken ship and every Nazi victory. The question was no longer asterisk. If asterisk America would enter the war, But what the final trigger would be, most people assumed it would happen in the Atlantic. No one was looking at the Pacific. No one was looking at Japan. The final push would come from a direction that few Americans expected, on a quiet Sunday morning in a place called Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. It's a Sunday morning, a day of rest for most Americans. The world is at war, but for the United States, that war is still an ocean away. Many believe, and fervently hope, that it will stay that way. The country is deeply divided. On one side, you have the isolationists, a powerful voice in American politics, arguing that the conflicts in Europe and Asia are not America's to fight. They champion a fortress America, protected by its vast oceans, focused on its own recovery from the Great Depression. On the other side are the internationalists, led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who see the growing threat of Axis aggression. They argue that if Britain falls, if the Axis powers control Europe and Asia, America will be next. It will be alone in a hostile world. For 2 years, this debate has raged. America has walked a tightrope. Through the Lend-Lease Act, it has become the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain, China, and the Soviet Union with vital war materials. American destroyers are escorting convoys in the Atlantic, engaging in an undeclared naval war with German U-boats. But boots on the ground? A formal declaration of war, that remains a step too far for a public wary of foreign entanglement, still haunted by the ghosts of World War I. The sentiment is clear. This is not our war. All of that is about to change in the blink of an eye, in a place most Americans have never even heard of, over 4,000 miles away from Washington, D.C. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean lies the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. It's just before 8 a.m. local time. The sky is clear. Sailors are waking up, preparing for church services, or looking forward to a lazy day ashore in Honolulu. On the decks of the battleships lined up in what's known as Battleship Row, bands are preparing to play the morning colors. It's a picture of absolute peace and tranquility. But beneath the calm surface of the water and hidden in the clouds above, a storm of unprecedented fury is about to break. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft, launched from carriers hundreds of miles away, are approaching Oahu. Their mission, to deliver a devastating surprise attack, to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single, decisive blow. Japan believes that this will buy them the time they need to conquer Southeast Asia and the Pacific, securing the resources they desperately need to fuel their empire. They are gambling that a stunned and weakened America will be forced to negotiate, leaving Japan as the undisputed power in the region. It is a bold, audacious, and ultimately catastrophic miscalculation. The first wave of planes screams down from the sky. The first bombs fall. The tranquil Sunday morning is shattered by explosions, the roar of engines, and the rattle of machine gun fire. Chaos erupts. The unprepared American forces are caught completely by surprise. Torpedoes slam into the sides of the battleships, moored helplessly at their berths. The USS Arizona is hit by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrates its forward magazine. The resulting explosion is cataclysmic, lifting the massive battleship out of the water and tearing it in half. It sinks in minutes, entombing over 1,100 of its crew. The USS Oklahoma capsizes, trapping hundreds of men inside. The USS West Virginia, the USS California, the USS Nevada all are sunk or heavily damaged. Across the island, airfields are strafed, destroying American planes on the ground before they even have a chance to take off. The attack is a military disaster of the highest order. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans are killed. 18 ships are sunk or damaged. The heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet lies in smoking ruins. News of the attack flashes across the globe. In Washington, the initial reports are met with disbelief, then with shock and outrage. The debate is over. The isolationists are silenced overnight. The attack on Pearl Harbor does not cower the American people. It galvanizes them. It unifies a divided nation with a single, burning purpose. The sleeping giant has been awoken, and it is filled with a terrible resolve. The next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt addresses a joint session of Congress. His voice, broadcast by radio into every home in the nation, is steady and grim. He begins with words that will echo through history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which we live in infamy the United States of America, was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He asks Congress to declare that since the attack, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The vote is nearly unanimous. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declare war on the United States. America is now fully engaged in a global conflict, fighting a two-ocean war against powers that control vast swaths of Europe and Asia. Across the Atlantic, in London, one man hears the news with a profound sense of relief and certainty. Prime Minister Winston Churchill has been fighting a lonely battle against Nazi Germany for over a year. He has watched as country after country fell to the Blitzkrieg, leaving Britain standing alone. He knew, with absolute conviction, that Britain could not win the war without the full industrial and military might of the United States. He had done everything in his power to persuade Roosevelt and the American people to join the fight, but he knew public opinion was the final barrier. When he learns of the attack on Pearl Harbor, he knows immediately that the war is won. He understands the immense power he has just gained as an ally. He would later write in his memoirs about that night, being saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation. I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. For Churchill, Pearl Harbor wasn't just an attack. It was the turning point. It was the moment the scales of history tipped decisively in favor of the Allies. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a short-term tactical victory for Japan, but it was a long-term strategic catastrophe. It propelled the United States into World War II, transforming the conflict and sealing the ultimate fate of the Axis powers. The peaceful Sunday morning in Hawaii had ended in fire and death, but it also marked the beginning of the end for the tyrannies that threatened to engulf the world. Today, we're exploring a chapter that's often overlooked. The anxious, nail-biting months between late 1941 and early 1942. The title of this chapter is The Promise of Help Still No Soldiers, and that pretty much sums it up. So, let's set the scene. It's December 1941. The devastating attack on Pearl Harbor has just happened, and America, the sleeping giant, has finally, officially, entered the war. For Great Britain, this should have been a moment of immense relief. For over a year, they had stood virtually alone against the might of the Axis powers. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had poured all his energy into courting President Franklin D. Roosevelt, desperately trying to bring the United States into the conflict. And now, it had happened. The industrial and military power of America was officially on their side. You can imagine the celebrations in the streets of London, the sighs of relief in the corridors of power. The cavalry was coming, or so they thought. But as the initial euphoria wore off, a stark and terrifying reality began to set in. The promise of American help was one thing. The actual arrival of soldiers, tanks, and planes on British soil was another thing entirely. And it wasn't happening. Not yet, anyway. This period was incredibly tense for Churchill and the British leadership. They were in a precarious position. On one hand, they had this massive new ally. On the other, they were more vulnerable than ever. Churchill was haunted by a single, terrifying question: what if Germany attacked again, right now, before American reinforcements could make a difference? He knew that Hitler was not one to sit idle. An all-out invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, had been postponed, not cancelled. What if Hitler saw this window of opportunity, this gap between America's declaration of war and its ability to project force across the Atlantic as his best chance to knock Britain out of the war for good? The fear was palpable. Every day that passed without a significant American military presence in the UK was another day Britain had to hold its breath. The British people, who had endured the Blitz with incredible courage, were now facing a new kind of psychological warfare. The agony of waiting. They had been promised salvation, but the saviors were nowhere in sight. Let's think about the American perspective for a moment. It's easy for us, looking back, to wonder why they didn't just immediately send 1 million troops to England. But we have to remember the sheer scale of what was being asked. The United States in late 1941 was not the global military superpower it would become. Its army was relatively small. Its industry was still geared for peacetime production, and it had just suffered a catastrophic blow to its Pacific fleet. America was suddenly fighting a two-front war. They had to deal with the immediate and aggressive expansion of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific, which was a direct threat to American territory and interests. The Philippines were under attack, and island after island was falling. Mobilizing for a global war from a standing start is a monumental task. It's not like flipping a switch. You need to recruit and train millions of soldiers, convert entire industries from making cars to making tanks, build thousands of ships to transport everything, and then actually get them safely across an ocean teeming with German U. This was the logistical nightmare facing the United States. Winston Churchill was getting increasingly anxious. He was in constant communication with Roosevelt, pleading, cajoling, and emphasizing the dire need for boots on the ground. He knew that the war in Europe could be lost before America was even fully in the fight. The Battle of the Atlantic was raging. German U-boats were sinking supply ships at an alarming rate, threatening to starve Britain into submission. Every ton of food, every barrel of oil, every rifle that made it across the ocean was a victory in itself. The British military was stretched to its absolute limit. They were fighting in North Africa against Rommel's Afrika Korps. They were engaged in the Far East, trying to hold back the Japanese, and they had to maintain a constant state of readiness at home to repel a potential invasion. They had the will, they had the courage, but their resources were dwindling. Manpower was a critical issue. After years of fighting, their reserves were low. This period, from December 41 to the spring of 42, was a high-stakes gamble. For Britain, it was about survival. They had to hold on just a little bit longer. For Germany, it was a race against time to deliver a knockout blow. For America, it was a frantic scramble to mobilize its immense potential before it was too late. Churchill's greatest fear was that Germany would launch a new, intensified bombing campaign, a second Blitz or, worse, a full-scale invasion. Knowing that Britain was at its weakest point, he knew that even the promise of future American aid would stop German bombs from falling on London, or German tanks from rolling onto British beaches. The psychological pressure on the British public was immense. Imagine hearing on the radio that America, this powerful new friend, has joined your side. The relief would be incredible. But then weeks turned into months, and you don't see any new soldiers in your town. The food rations don't get any bigger. The nightly blackouts continue. The threat of air raids is still there. You start to wonder, are they really coming? And will they get here in time? This chapter of the war is a powerful lesson in the difference between political reality and military reality. A declaration of war is a line drawn in the sand, but moving armies across the world is a Herculean effort that takes time. And in war, time is the deadliest commodity of all. Britain was running out of it, and they knew it. So as we close this chapter, we leave Britain in a state of suspended animation, hopeful but terrified, allied with the world's greatest industrial power, but still fighting alone on the front lines. The promise of help had been made, but the horizon was still empty of soldiers. The race was on, and the fate of the free world hung precariously in the balance. January 1942. The world holds its breath. Europe is a fortress, and Britain stands alone, battered but defiant, after years of relentless war. The Blitz may have subsided, but the threat from the sea is constant. U-boat wolf-packs prowl the Atlantic, turning the ocean into a graveyard of steel and hopes. Every ship that leaves port is a gamble, every sunrise a small victory. The British people, weary from rationing and loss, look to the west, praying for a sign that they are not alone. They've heard the promises, the fireside chats from across the ocean, but promises don't win wars. They need more than words. They need men. They need machines. They need all be delivered in person. And then, on a cold, gray morning, it begins. A whisper at first, carried on the salty air of the River Thames. A rumor that spreads through the docks of London, then ignites across the city like wildfire. Look, on the horizon, ships. Not the familiar silhouettes of the Royal Navy, not the battered merchant vessels limping home. These are different, sleek, gray, purposeful, and they are flying a flag not seen in these numbers on British shores for a very long time. The stars and stripes. This isn't just a convoy. It's an armada of hope. The first American transports have crossed the treacherous Atlantic. They've run the gauntlet of the U-boats, braving the icy waves and the unseen predators lurking beneath. On board are thousands of young men, the first wave of what will become a torrent of American might. They're the vanguard of Operation Bolero, the massive buildup of U.S. forces in the United Kingdom. Imagine the scene. Londoners, accustomed to the sight of bomb damage and the drone of air raid sirens, rush to the riverbanks. Dockworkers pause, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning joy. Children are hoisted onto shoulders to get a better view. The ships, massive and imposing, glide up the Thames, their decks crowded with soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms. These aren't actors on a newsreel screen anymore. They are real. Real air. Air as the first transport, the Chateau Thierry, nudges against the quay in Belfast, Northern Ireland. The dam of British Reserve finally breaks. A roar erupts from the crowd. It's a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. It's the sound of a nation realizing it is no longer fighting alone. The G's, as they would come to be known, are a sight to behold. They look so different, well-fed, confident. Their uniforms crisp and new. They carry with them an air of another world, a world untouched by years of blackout and bombardment. They file down the gangplanks, their boots hitting British soil for the first time. For the locals, it's a moment of sheer electricity. For the soldiers, it's a mix of excitement and apprehension. They've left their homes, their families, their sweethearts, and traveled 3,000 miles to a foreign land to fight a war that, until recently, felt a world away. They see the bombed-out buildings, the determined but tired faces of the British people, and the reality of their mission begins to sink in. A military band strikes up a tune. It's a surreal, almost cinematic moment. Amidst the formalities, the handshakes between officers, the real connection happens between the people. A British dockworker offers an American soldier a cup of tea. A child waves a small, handmade American flag. A GI tosses a pack of chewing gum to a group of onlookers. A small gesture that speaks volumes. "Got any gum?" Jump would soon become a common refrain, a symbol of this friendly invasion. The arrival is a logistical marvel, but it's the human drama that truly electrifies the nation. Newspapers splashed the images across their front pages. Smiling American boys marching through the streets, their fresh faces a stark contrast to the war-weary landscape. The message is clear and powerful. America is in the fight. The Yanks are here. This wasn't just a reinforcement. It was a psychological turning point. The arrival of these first troops sent a shockwave through the Axis powers. It demonstrated the industrial and logistical power of the United States, a sleeping giant now fully awake and committed. For Hitler, it was a confirmation of his worst fears, a two-front war against enemies with seemingly limitless resources. For the occupied peoples of Europe, it was a beacon of liberation, a tangible promise that help was on its way. The soldiers themselves were a fascinating study in contrasts. Many were from small towns and farms across America, and for them, England was as exotic as the moon. They marveled at the small cars driving on the wrong side of the road, the quaint pubs, the strange currency of pounds, shillings, and pence. They brought with them their own culture, jazz music, Coca-Cola, and an easygoing optimism that was both baffling and infectious to their British hosts. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There would be culture clashes, misunderstandings, and the inevitable strain of hosting millions of foreign soldiers. The famous saying, overpaid, and over here, held a kernel of truth, born from the friction of two different worlds colliding. The American GI earned significantly more than his British counterpart, leading to friendly and sometimes not-so-friendly rivalries. But in those first few weeks of 1942, all of that was in the future. The overwhelming feeling was one of unity and shared purpose. The arrival on the Thames was more than just a military deployment. It was the physical embodiment of the Grand Alliance. It was the moment the tide began to turn. From this foothold, the plans for the liberation of Europe would be forged. From these docks, the Great Crusade would eventually be launched. The image of those first American soldiers stepping onto British soil became iconic. a symbol of transatlantic solidarity etched into the memory of a generation. It was a promise kept, a prayer answered. It was the beginning of the end. The long, dark night was far from over. But on that cold January day, for the first time in a long time, the people of Britain could see the undeniable light of dawn breaking in the west. The ships had arrived, and wheat. Then they brought the one thing more powerful than any weapon. Hope. It's January 1942. London is a city scarred by war, still reeling from the Blitz. The air is cold, thick with the smell of damp stone and the lingering memory of smoke. In the heart of this weary city, inside number 10 Downing Street, a figure stands silhouetted against a tall window. It's Winston Churchill. His shoulders, usually so broad and defiant, seem heavy with the weight of a nation. For over 2 long, brutal years, Britain has stood virtually alone against the might of the Axis powers. Every day has been a struggle for survival, a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. The future of the free world rested on this small island, and the burden on its leader was immense. From his vantage point, Churchill looks down onto the streets below. But today, the scene is different. The familiar rumble of London traffic is replaced by a new sound, a rhythmic, powerful cadence that grows stronger with every passing second. It's the sound of marching feet, thousands upon thousands of them. He squints, leaning closer to the glass. It's not the familiar khaki of the British Tommies. This is a different uniform, a different shade of olive drab, and on their shoulders, a small but unmistakable emblem. The stars and stripes, the Yanks, the Americans' day, are the first columns of the United States Army are marching through London. They are young, fresh-faced, and full of a confidence that a war-weary Europe had almost forgotten. They march with a spring in their step, their modern equipment gleaming even under the gray London sky. They are a tangible, undeniable symbol of hope. Promise! A massive wave of industrial might and manpower, now thrown into the scales of war on the side of freedom. For months, Churchill had worked tirelessly, pleaded, and negotiated to bring America into the fight. He knew that without the United States, victory was a distant, almost impossible dream. Now, that dream was marching past his window. As he watches them, a profound change comes over him. The tension that had held him rigid for so long finally begins to dissolve. His stoic, bulldog expression, the face of defiance he showed the world, starts to crumble. He sees the columns of soldiers stretching as far as the eye can see, a river of strength flowing through the heart of his beleaguered capital. He hears the cheers of the Londoners lining the streets, their voices hoarse with emotion, a mixture of gratitude and sheer, unadulterated relief. They are no longer alone. We are no longer alone. The thought echoes in his mind, a powerful, overwhelming refrain. And then, something remarkable happens. Winston Churchill, the great wartime leader, the man of iron will, the voice of defiance that had rallied a nation, begins to weep. It's not a quiet, controlled display of emotion. His private secretary, John Calville, who was in the room with him, later described it. He said Churchill's face was wet with tears. They streamed down his cheeks, unchecked. These weren't tears of sadness or despair. They were tears of profound, soul-shaking relief. The release of an unbearable pressure that he had carried, day in and day out, for 800 days. It was the emotional breaking of a dam that had held back a sea of anxiety and fear. In that moment, at that window, Churchill wasn't just a prime minister. He was every Briton who had huddled in a bomb shelter, every pilot who had scrambled to meet the Luftwaffe, every sailor who had braved the U-boat-infested Atlantic. He felt the collective sigh of relief of an entire nation. The sight of those American soldiers was more than just a strategic advantage. It was an emotional salvation. It meant that the sacrifices had not been in vain. It meant there was a clear path to victory, no matter how long and hard the road ahead might be. He saw in those marching men not just allies, but Brozin. He saw the new world, with all its power and might, stepping forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old. It's a moment It's often overlooked in the grand sweep of World War II history, but it's one of the most human and poignant. It reveals the man behind the legend, the sheer, crushing weight of leadership in the darkest of times, and the profound emotional release when a glimmer of dawn finally breaks through the night. Churchill himself later wrote about America's entry into the war, saying he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. But watching those troops march through London was different. It was the visceral, visual confirmation of that salvation. It was the moment the numbers on a page, the promises in a cable, became flesh and blood. This wasn't the end of the war. Not by a long shot. Years of brutal fighting still lay ahead. But it was, as Churchill famously said after the victory at El Alamein later that year, the end of the beginning. The tide had turned, and for the man standing at the window, his face streaked with tears, it was the moment he knew, with absolute certainty, that they were going to win. The sight of the American GIS marching through the streets of London was the physical embodiment of hope, a symbol that tyranny would be defeated, and that freedom would ultimately prevail. It was a silent, powerful testament to the alliance that would change the course of history forever. Imagine it's the winter of 1942. For 3 long, grueling years, Britain has stood against the might of the Axis powers. The Blitz has scarred cities, rationing has tightened its grip on every household, and the news from the front lines has often been bleak. Hope is a commodity as scarce as sugar. The British people, resilient but weary, are holding on by a thread, wondering just how much longer they can endure. Then, almost overnight, everything changes. They started arriving in trickles, then in a flood. A new kind of soldier on British soil. Not in a familiar khaki of the British Tommies, but in a different shade of olive drab. They were the GIs, the Americans, the Yanks. And with them, they brought more than just fresh manpower and equipment. They brought a palpable, electrifying wave of optimism that swept across the nation. Suddenly, the streets of London, Liverpool, and Belfast were filled with these new uniforms. The sight was a jolt to the system. For the British people, seeing these American soldiers, so full of confidence and energy, was like the first ray of sunshine after a long, brutal storm. It was tangible proof that they were no longer alone. The world's greatest industrial power was now standing shoulder to shoulder with them. This wasn't just a political alliance anymore. It was real. It was here, and it was walking down their street. Newspapers of the day, which had been filled with somber reports and calls for yet more sacrifice, suddenly burst with a new kind of headline. Photos of Smiling G's sharing chewing gum with local children, of British and American troops training together, of packed dance halls filled with a whirlwind of jitterbugging couples. The press captured this shift in mood perfectly. Editorials that once spoke of grim determination now spoke of inevitable victory. The arrival of the Americans wasn't just a footnote. It was the front-page story, a symbol that the tide of the war was finally turning. Let's step back onto the streets and listen. What did people actually say? In pubs from Southampton to Glasgow, the chatter changed. Eyewitness accounts and diaries from the time are filled with similar observations. You'd hear things like, "They're so tall," or "Have you heard them talk?" It's just like in the films. The American accent, previously only heard in Hollywood movies, was now the sound of hope, echoing in the local grocer's shop. These EGs were different. They seemed bigger, healthier, and impossibly well-fed to a nation that had been living on strict rations for years. They had money in their pockets, a confident swagger in their step, and a friendly, open demeanor that often disarmed the more reserved British locals. They handed out things that had become luxuries. Chocolate, cigarettes, nylon stockings. These small acts of generosity were more than just gifts. They were symbols of America's vast resources and its commitment to the fight. Each piece of candy given to a wide-eyed child was a small promise of a better future. Of course, it wasn't all a perfect fairy tale. There were cultural clashes, misunderstandings, and the famous grumbled that the Yanks were overpaid, over here. But beneath the friendly rivalries and occasional friction, there was a deep, underlying sense of shared purpose. British families opened their homes to these young men from Ohio, Texas, and California, offering a Sunday roast and a brief respite from the rigors of military life. In return, The G has brought stories of a world beyond the blackout curtains, a world of vast plains, bustling cities, and limitless possibility. This friendly invasion had a profound psychological impact. The mere presence of hundreds of thousands of fresh, confident allies boosted British morale in a way no political speech ever could. It alleviated the crushing burden of being the last major bastion against tyranny in Europe. For the factory worker putting in a 12-hour shift, the farmer tilling a field under the threat of air raids, the housewife trying to make a meal out of meager rations. The sight of an American uniform was a physical reminder that victory was not just a distant dream but a coming reality. Think about the children of that era. For them, the G's were like characters from another planet. They had strange accents, drove fascinating jeeps, and possessed an endless supply of chewing gum. These interactions provided moments of joy and normalcy in a childhood defined by war. The soldiers, many of them just boys themselves and far from home, found a sense of connection and purpose in these simple exchanges. The laughter of children became a powerful antidote to the anxieties of war. The change was everywhere. Dance halls were suddenly packed. The sounds of Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman, once a treat on the radio, were now the live soundtrack to a nation rediscovering its ability to celebrate. For a few hours, amidst the swing and the jitterbug, the war could be forgotten. These moments of levity were crucial. They recharged the spirit of the people, giving them the emotional fuel to keep going. The arrival of the Americans didn't just bolster the army, it revitalized the soul of the nation. So, when we look back at the winter of 1942, we see more than just a strategic military deployment. We see a moment when the mood of an entire country changed overnight. The arrival of the American G has turned despair into determination and anxiety into anticipation. It was the moment Britain collectively took a deep breath and realized that the long, dark night of war was finally beginning to break, and a new dawn, brought across the Atlantic, was on the horizon. The Yanks were here, and with them they brought the one thing Britain needed most: a firm, unshakable belief that they were going to win. Imagine this. It's 1942. Your quiet, British town, used to rationing and the drone of air raid sirens, is suddenly flooded with over 1 million young, loud, and confident American soldiers. The Yanks have arrived. This was Operation Bolero, the massive buildup of U.S. forces in Britain, and it kicked off one of the biggest and most fascinating culture clashes in history. The British had a saying for their new guests: overpaid, oversexed, and over here. It was a joke, mostly, but like all good jokes, it had a kernel of truth. Let's break it down. Overpaid was definitely true. An American GI private earned about 4 times what his British counterpart, the Tommy, made. 4 times. Suddenly, these Americans had pockets full of cash, and they weren't shy about spending it. This meant they could afford things the locals only dreamed of, like nights out at the pub, treating ladies to dances, and buying scarce goods. It created a bit of resentment, you can imagine. British lads found it hard to compete for a girl's attention when a GI could stroll in, flash a smile, and offer nylon stockings, a luxury almost impossible to find in wartime Britain. Then there's oversexed. The GIs were young men, far from home, facing the prospect of combat and death. They were looking for a good time, for connection, for a moment of normalcy in a world gone mad. They were often more direct and forward than British men, which could be seen as charming by some and shockingly bold by others. Romance blossomed everywhere. It's estimated that by the end of the war, around 70,000 British women had married American servicemen. These GI brides were a huge phenomenon. They were women who fell in love and chose to leave everything they knew behind: family, friends, their entire country too, start a new life across the Atlantic. It sounds romantic, and it often was, but it also caused friction. Families were worried, and local men felt left behind. And finally, over here, the sheer number of Americans was overwhelming. By 1944, there were over 1.5 million G is in the UK. They were everywhere. Their accents, their slang words like swell, dame, and okay, and their habits were completely foreign. Americans chewed gum loudly, a habit the British found rather uncivilized. They put sugar in their tea. A sacrilege! They played this strange game called baseball in the parks. They were hoost. Differin. British politeness and reserve clashed with American openness and boisterous energy. A simple hello could be a minefield. An American might say, "Hiya, pal. How's it hanging?" while a Brit would offer a reserved good morning. These small misunderstandings could easily build into bigger frustrations. Pubs became cultural battlegrounds. Fights, often over gers or just plain misunderstanding, weren't uncommon. There were "Yanks go home" signs scrawled on walls. It was a genuine culture shock on a national scale. But here's the crucial part of the story, the part that often gets lost in the cliches. Despite the clashes, the grumbling, and the occasional fistfight, these two groups of people found a way to connect. They had to. They were allies in a fight for survival. The GIs weren't just invaders. They were guests in British homes. Many families adopted a GI, inviting him for Sunday dinner, offering a taste of home life to a lonely young man thousands of miles from his own family. The American soldiers, in turn, shared their ration skillet, candy, and coffee with British children who had grown up in a world of austerity. These small acts of kindness built powerful bridges. GIs learned to appreciate the British stiff upper lip, their resilience and humor in the face of constant bombing and hardship. The British, in turn, began to see past the loud exteriors of the Americans and recognized their generosity, their optimism, and their genuine desire to help win the war. They played sports together. Guys tried their hand at cricket, and Tommies were introduced to the mysteries of American football. They shared songs, stories, and drinks in the pubs. They were young men from different worlds, united by a common purpose. When you look at the letters and diaries from that time, you see the transformation. Initial suspicion gave way to curiosity, and curiosity often grew into real friendship and respect. A GI might write home complaining about the warm beer and the constant rain, but in the next sentence, he'd talk about the incredible courage of the Londoners he'd met. A British woman might write in her diary about how loud and brash her American neighbors were, but then describe how they helped her fix her roof after a bombing raid. This wasn't just a military alliance, it became a personal one, forged in village halls, pubs, and family living rooms across the United Kingdom. They learned to understand each other's slang. They learned to laugh at each other's jokes. The GS brought a splash of Hollywood glamour and a can-do spirit to a weary, war-torn Britain. The British offered the Americans a sense of history, tradition, and unwavering resolve. Ultimately, the story of the friendly invasion is a story of human connection. It shows that even with massive cultural differences, when people are brought together by a shared goal and a willingness to understand one another, they can form bonds that are stronger than any misunderstanding. They went from being strangers to allies to friends. And when those same GIs left Britain for the shores of Normandy on D-Day, they weren't just leaving a military base. They were leaving behind friends, sweethearts, and a second home. They were leaving a country that had, despite all the initial grumbling, taken them into its heart. This incredible, complex, and deeply human chapter of the war laid the foundation for the special relationship between the US and the UK that continues to this day. A relationship born not in the halls of power, but in the towns and villages where two cultures clashed, complained, and ultimately came together. Imagine this. It is 1942. The world is holding its breath. Europe is suffocating under the boot of the Axis powers, and Great Britain stands as a lonely, defiant island, battered but not broken. The question on everyone's mind is not asterisk if asterisk Britain will fall, but asterisk when asterisk. And then something incredible begins to happen. A trickle, then a stream, and finally a flood. A wave of hope, steel, and humanity starts to cross the Atlantic. This is the story of how America, the sleeping giant, awoke and transformed Britain into the springboard for the liberation of a continent. This is the story of the arsenal of democracy. When the United States officially entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the gears of a nation were already turning. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had famously declared that America must be the great arsenal of democracy. But words are one thing, action is another. What unfolded between 1942 and 1944 was a logistical and industrial miracle that has no parallel in human history. It wasn't just about sending soldiers. It was about moving an entire nation's industrial might 3,000 miles across a hostile ocean. The first thing you would have noticed if you were in Britain during this time was the people. They called it the friendly invasion. Suddenly, American accents were everywhere, from the pubs of London to the quiet lanes of rural villages. These were the GIs, the government-issue soldiers. By 1944, over 1.5 million American troops were stationed in the UK. Think about that number. It was a massive cultural exchange. British kids were introduced to chewing gum and baseball, while young American soldiers from Ohio or Texas found themselves trying to navigate the peculiarities of British tea time and driving on the left side of the road. These weren't tourists. Of course, they were here for one reason: to prepare for the largest amphibious invasion ever conceived. They trained relentlessly on the moors of Scotland and the beaches of Devon, simulating the exact conditions they would face on the heavily fortified shores of Normandy. The entire southern coast of England became a gigantic military camp, a coiled spring of power, waiting to be unleashed. The sheer presence of this massive army was a constant, visible promise to the people of Britain and occupied Europe. Help is here. Liberation is coming. But an army, no matter how large, is useless without its tools. And this is where the arsenal part of the story truly comes to life. American factories, which had been churning out cars and refrigerators just a few years earlier, had completely retooled for war. The results were staggering. Take aircraft, for instance. Giants of the sky like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator began arriving in vast numbers, their silver fuselages filling the airfields of East Anglia. This region became known as Little America because of the sheer density of American airbase. From these fields, the 8th Air Force launched its daylight bombing campaign against strategic targets deep inside Germany. These missions were incredibly dangerous, flown without long-range fighter escorts in the early days. The courage of those young air crews is a story in itself, but their impact was monumental. They crippled German war production, destroyed transportation networks, and forced the Luftwaffe to pull its best pilots and planes back to defend the homeland, weakening its grip on other fronts. Alongside the RAV's nighttime bombing, they were systematically dismantling the Third Reich's ability to wage war. Then there were the fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a brute of a plane, and the elegant, long-range P-51 Mustang. The arrival of the Mustang, in particular, was a complete game-changer. With its incredible range, it could finally escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, drastically reducing the catastrophic losses the bomber crews had been suffering. The skies over Europe, once the domain of the Messerschmitt and the Focke-Wulf, were now contested and, eventually, dominated by American air power. On the ground, the transformation was just as dramatic. The iconic vehicle of this era was the Jeep. Small, rugged, and ridiculously versatile. The Willys MB Jeep was everywhere. It served as a command car, a scout vehicle, an ambulance, and a general-purpose workhorse. It was a symbol of American ingenuity and go-anywhere capability. Along with the Jeeps came the trucks. Thousands upon thousands of GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, the backbone of Army logistics, poured into Britain. They were the lifeblood of the Allied war machine, hauling everything from ammunition and fuel to food and soldiers. And we can't forget the tanks. The M4 Sherman tank became the principal tank of the Western Allies. While it was often outgunned by the heavier German Panther and Tiger tanks, its strength was in numbers and reliability. For every one German Tiger, the Allies could field dozens of Shermans. American factories were producing them at a breathtaking rate. They would be repaired, rearmed, and sent back into the fight, a testament to the power of mass production. This industrial might ensured that Allied commanders could always count on a steady, overwhelming supply of armor. All of this hardware had to cross the Atlantic, an ocean infested with German U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic was a brutal, drawn-out conflict. But by 1943, thanks to improved technology, air cover, and convoy tactics, the Allies had gained the upper hand. The Liberty ships were the heroes of this battle. These were mass-produced cargo ships, built faster than the U-boats could sink them. They weren't pretty, and they weren't fast, but they got the job done. They carried the tanks, The planes, the fuel, the bullets, the food, the litra, nuts, and bolts of war too. The shores of Britain. Every crate of rations, every jerrycan of gasoline, every box of 50 caliber ammunition that landed in a British port was another nail in the coffin of the Axis. The scale of it all is almost impossible to comprehend. Docks in Liverpool, Glasgow, and Bristol were swamped with American supplies. Huge depots and warehouses sprang up overnight across the countryside to store this mountain of material. Britain itself was transformed into a massive forward operating base. It was the world's largest aircraft carrier, a supply dump, a training ground, and a barracks, all rolled into one. This period was not without its tensions. The influx of so many people and so much materiel put an immense strain on Britain's resources, already stretched thin by years of war. There were cultural clashes and misunderstandings. The GIs were often seen as overpaid, oversexed, and overhere. But beneath the surface-level friction was a deep, shared sense of purpose. Both sides knew what was at stake. They were partners in a monumental undertaking: the D-Day landings and the liberation of Europe. As 1944 dawned, the final pieces were falling into place. The men were trained, the machines were in position, and the supplies were stockpiled. Looking out across southern England, you would have seen a landscape bristling with the power of a nation mobilized for total war. It was the physical manifestation of America's promise. The arsenal of democracy had not just delivered. It had created a force so powerful that it would crack open Fortress Europe and begin the final march toward victory. The Great Crusade was about to begin, and it was launched from the shores of an island that had been saved and transformed by its friends from across the sea. December 22nd, 1941. A cold night in Washington, D.C. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, arrives at the White House. He's just crossed a treacherous, U-boat-infested Atlantic. A journey that took 10 long days. His mission: to forge an alliance with America, a nation still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor just 2 weeks earlier. That night, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt greeted him, Churchill, a man known for his iron will and stoic resolve, broke down. Tears streamed down his face. He later wrote, "We were all together. I had not crossed the seas to sunder the Anglo-American peoples, but to weld them together as none had ever been welded before." Those tears weren't a sign of weakness. They were a symbol of relief, of hope, and the birth of a partnership that would change the course of history and ultimately save the world from tyranny. This is the story of the Grand Alliance, the unlikely coalition of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and how their combined might crushed the Axis powers. By the start of 1942, the situation looked bleak. The Axis controlled nearly all of continental Europe, from the coasts of France to the outskirts of Moscow. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps was threatening Egypt and the vital Suez Canal. In the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was expanding at a terrifying rate, capturing Singapore, the Philippines, and much of Southeast Asia. The world was on a knife's edge. The Allies needed a strategy, and they needed it fast. The first major decision was the Germany First policy. Despite the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that Nazi Germany was the primary threat. It possessed a massive industrial base, a battle-hardened army, and the potential to develop devastating new weapons. If Germany defeated the Soviet Union, it would become an unconquerable fortress. The Pacific could wait. The full weight of American industrial power and British resolve had to be brought to bear on Hitler first. This decision was formalized at the Arcadia Conference in Washington, the very meeting Churchill had risked his life to attend. It was a pivotal moment that set the strategic direction for the entire war. But an alliance on paper is one thing. Making it work in practice is another entirely. The Big Three: Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were three. Very different men leading three very different nations. Churchill was the bulldog, the old imperialist fighting to preserve the British Empire. Roosevelt was the pragmatic idealist, dreaming of a post-war world governed by new principles of freedom. And Stalin was the ruthless dictator, a communist tyrant who had once signed a pact with Hitler, now forced into a marriage of convenience. Their relationship was fraught with suspicion and competing interests. Stalin constantly pressured the Western Allies to open a second front in France, to relieve the immense pressure on the Red Army, which was bearing the brunt of the fighting. The first real test of Anglo-American cooperation came in North Africa. Operation Torch, in November 1942, saw American and British forces land in Morocco and Algeria. The goal was to trap Rommel's forces between them and Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from Egypt, commanded by a relatively unknown American general named WWII. The operation was a logistical masterpiece, but a messy, hard-fought campaign. It was a steep learning curve for the inexperienced American troops, but it was a success. By May 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. The Mediterranean was finally being secured, paving the way for the next step: the invasion of Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill famously called it. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war's most decisive and brutal struggle was reaching its climax. The Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943, was a turning point. The German 6th Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was encircled and utterly destroyed. The human cost was staggering, with casualties on both sides, numbering in the millions. But for the first time, the myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Red Army began its long, brutal push westward, a relentless advance that would not stop until it reached Berlin. The sacrifice of the Soviet people was immense, and it was this sacrifice that truly bled the German army dry. With momentum on their side, the Big Three met in Tehran in November 1943. It was the first time all three leaders were in the same room. The atmosphere was tense. Stalin, confident after the victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, renewed his demands for a second front in France. This time, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed. They committed to a cross-channel invasion in the spring of 1944. The codename was Operation Overlord. The planning for this immense undertaking was already well underway. It would be the largest amphibious invasion in human history, a colossal gamble that would determine the fate of Western Europe. At the same time, the war in the air was escalating dramatically. The Allied combined bomber offensive was pounding German cities and industries. Day and night, the British Royal Air Force bombed by night, while the American 8th Air Force conducted precision daylight raids. The goal was to cripple Germany's war production and break the morale of its people. Early on, the losses were horrific, especially for the American crews flying unescorted deep into enemy territory. But the arrival of long-range escort fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, changed the game. By 1944, the Allies had achieved air supremacy over Europe, which was an absolute prerequisite for a successful D-Day invasion. And then, on June 6, 1944, D-Day arrived. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. The landings were a triumph of planning, deception, and sheer courage. The fighting on beaches like Omaha was terrifyingly fierce, but the soldiers pushed through. A foothold was established. The second front Stalin had demanded for so long was finally a reality. The liberation of France had begun. By August, Paris was free. The Allied armies, a mix of Americans, British, Canadians, Poles, and Free French, surged across France and towards the German border. It seemed the war might be over by Christmas, but Hitler had one last, desperate gamble left. In December 1944, he launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, aiming to split the Allied forces and recapture the port of Antwerp. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like it might work. American units were surrounded, and the weather grounded the all-powerful Allied air forces. But the heroic defense of key towns like Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne famously refused to surrender, held the line. When the skies finally cleared, Allied air power decimated the German armored columns. The offensive failed, and in doing so, exhausted the last of Germany's elite reserves. The path to the heart of the Reich was now open. As 1945 began, the end was in sight. In February, the Big Three met for the last time at Yalta. They were there to plan the final defeat of Germany and, more importantly, to decide what the post-war world would look like. They agreed to divide Germany into zones of occupation and to form a new international body to prevent future wars of the United Nations. But the cracks in the alliance were beginning to show. Deep disagreements over the future of Poland and Eastern Europe hinted at the new conflict that would soon emerge: the Cold War. In the final months, the Allied armies closed in on Berlin from both east and west. The Western Allies crossed the Rhine in March. The Soviets, in a final, bloody offensive, encircled and stormed the German capital. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet soldiers just blocks from his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. A week later, on May 8th, Germany surrendered. Unconditional V-Day, victory in Europe, was declared. Crowds celebrated in London, Paris, and New York. The war in Europe was over. The Grand Alliance, born from desperation and sealed with Churchill's tears, had achieved its primary goal. It was a partnership forged in the crucible of war, a testament to the idea that even the most disparate nations can unite against a common, existential threat. It wasn't a perfect alliance. It was messy, contentious, and driven by self-interest, as much as by shared ideals. But it worked. It mobilized the industrial might of America, the resilience of Britain, and the immense human sacrifice of the Soviet Union to defeat one of the most evil regimes in history. The world we live in today was shaped in those tumultuous years, a world built on the foundations laid by that alliance that won the war. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into history, be sure to like and subscribe for more.